Well, hello. Greetings to my fellow Nystagmus researchers and to the board and members of the Nystagmus Network. For those who don't know me, my name is John Erichsen. I'm the professor of visual neuroscience at Cardiff University, and I head up the Cardiff Eye Movement Experimental Research Group, which is known as eMERGE. Since establishing our research unit for nystagmus, or RUN, many years ago, we've been carrying out studies of the causes and consequences of nystagmus eye movements. And this work has been made possible largely by the support of nystagmus and vision charities such as Nystagmus Network, Fight for Sight, as well as more recently Envision. I'm privileged to work with a large group of talented and dedicated researchers who include Maggie Woodhouse, Matt Dunn, Lee McElreevy, Fergal Ennis, Tony Redmond, and Jennifer Acton, as well as previous students and postdocs who have now moved on to other universities as lecturers to carry on their research. In the brief time I have today, I thought it might be of interest to those of you who are not carrying out research to let you have a quick peek behind the curtains, so to speak, to better understand the kinds of problems and issues that we're trying to address in our studies. In other words, I'd like to present a kind of agenda for research that we're currently following. The former US Secretary of Defense, Ronald Rumsfeld, many years ago coined the phrase of known unknowns, and I'm going to use that as my theme for my discussion of nystagmus research. So here's my presentation, and there's the title and the logo for our unit, Research Unit for Nystagmus. So as you will know, nystagmus presents us with a range of challenges. These include, but aren't limited to, the fact that nystagmus is associated with a bewildering variety of different disorders, and yet the nystagmus looks the same. Nystagmus itself can be highly variable in phenotype, not only between people, but even within a given individual. We suffer from the fact that there isn't a good, compelling animal model for nystagmus yet, although there has been some progress in that regard recently. And finally, last but not least, funding is a bit scarce in this area, and that's partly because nystagmus is not progressive, and therefore isn't seen sometimes as the priority that I believe it should be. So what are the known unknowns of nystagmus? I've listed here just a sample of the sorts of questions that we've been asking and investigating in the last few years. And we, as well as other researchers, have made some real progress, we believe, at answering some of them. I've bolded a couple that will be the focus for today. So for example, why is nystagmus the same even though the underlying condition can be so different? Why is there a region of gaze positions or eye positions where the nystagmus is dampened? And does this have any impact on visual perception? Do changes in the eye movements affect visual acuity? That may seem a strange question. A lot of people just assume that's true. Can visual perception occur throughout the eye movement, even though sometimes the eyes aren't looking at the target or the object of interest? And finally, how is it that people with nystagmus perceive the world as stable, largely, even though their eyes are moving continuously? So as some of you will know, if you record the changes in eye position over time, there turn out to be 12 different waveform types or shapes in the changes in eye position over time. And interestingly, these waveforms can be found in all of the underlying conditions that are associated with nystagmus and the emergence of those eye movements. When analyzing these waveforms, we tend to measure how frequently the oscillations occur, how big they are, and the average velocity, or what we call intensity, of the nystagmus. In addition, the period during which the eyes are moving the most slowly is called the foveation. We can use these numbers or parameters to investigate quantitatively the impact of different waveforms and intensities on vision. Here we have asked someone with nystagmus to slowly shift their gaze from extreme left all the way over to the right. You can clearly see from the arrow here that there is a range of gaze positions when the intensity or average velocity of the nystagmus is dramatically reduced. This is called the null zone. And if this is not straight ahead, people will often adopt a head turn to place their eyes at this angle to minimize their nystagmus. If we look at this a different way, we plot the different parameter, and now we're looking at the duration of the foveation, that slow period, slowest period of the eye movement. In this null zone, you'll see that the duration of the foveation period increases dramatically, which means that the eyes are moving much more slowly in this range of gaze angles than when, for example, in this case, the individual is looking to the left. Now, the assumption has always been that this provides improved vision, and this is why people adopt this head posture. We can see from these eye movement traces that the shape and intensity and indeed frequency of nystagmus can change significantly within the same individual. And this can happen as a result of changes to emotional state, including stress, or as we've just seen, changes in gaze angle. Now, interestingly, if you plot the average nystagmus intensity of different individuals against their visual acuity, you can see a clear relationship or correlation whereby the lower the intensity, the better the acuity or vision. In the graph that is showing at the moment on the left, the next graph will indicate that individuals lie along different portions of this curve. But in the graph on the left, as you move to the right, the foveation duration is increasing. And as you move up in the graph, visual acuity gets worse. So we can see from this that the longer your foveation duration, the better your acuity, and the shorter the foveation duration, the worse the acuity. But this is between individuals. So the question is, what happens if you make changes in the foveation duration or intensity within an individual? So we decided to ask participants to systematically shift their gaze by using a computer-controlled rotating mirror, which should produce big changes in their nystagmus intensity. At each position, we then measured their acuity. The question we were asking is whether the changes in their eye movements altered their visual acuity. So you can see here in the three columns of these plots, three different individuals, and you can see that as they change gaze position from right, or in the case of the one on the left, sorry, the one on the right is the left, you'll see that there are big changes in amplitude and frequency of the eye movements within an individual, so along each column, as they change their angle of gaze. So we have achieved, so that part of the experiment worked. We asked people to change their gaze, and we see big changes in their eye movements. And yet, to our surprise, none of the properties or features of the nystagmus showed any relationship with visual acuity. So in other words, we couldn't get any kind of quantitative relationship such that when, for example, an eye movement became more intense, that the visual acuity became less. But notwithstanding that, acuity was very slightly improved in the null zone, although corresponding to less than a line on an optometrist's letter chart. Given how much the intensity of the eye movements had changed within each of these individuals, we had expected a much bigger effect on vision. When we did a similar experiment, but this time changing eye movements by introducing stress, not always the most popular experiment amongst our volunteers, we had a similar result. There was no meaningful change in visual acuity despite very big effects on all aspects of the eye movements. So this was a bit puzzling to us. So it would appear to indicate that changes in eye movements within an individual are not really having much impact on their vision, at least as measured by visual acuity. So next, we did another study in which we used very brief flashes of light to make the stimulus, in this case a fine grating, appear to stand still or frozen despite the nystagmus because the flash was so brief. And doing this, we tested people's acuity as the ability to perceive finer and finer gratings until they could no longer distinguish them as a grating. Again, to our surprise, we found that although those with nystagmus had lower acuity overall, and that's higher on the chart here. So again, as before, when you go higher in this graph, the worse the acuity. So you can see the subjects without nystagmus had acuity that was quite good, the sort of normal standard acuity, but we can see that people with nystagmus had worse acuity on average. But although they did have this lower acuity, you can see that the acuity did not change whether or not the light was continuous or flashed. That is, there was no difference in acuity whether the eyes moved over the grating because of the continuous oscillations, or the grating appeared to stand still or be static. This demonstrated about as clearly as we thought we could that the eye movements themselves have very little, if any, influence on visual acuity in a given individual with nystagmus. And when we first started reporting this, it seemed rather controversial, but I believe quite a few other researchers have now demonstrated similar effects in this condition. So another question we have addressed recently is, do people with nystagmus need more time to see things well? So we presented letters that became smaller and smaller and varied the time during which the letter was on the display screen. So that time became anywhere from 5 seconds down to a fraction of a second. In this case, we can see that whether you have nystagmus or not, as the presentation time is reduced, so that's you're going left along the x-axis of this graph, eventually acuity is affected. You begin to go up in the graph. That is, your acuity begins to deteriorate. And that makes intuitive sense. You need a certain minimum amount of time to see something. However, the impact of this reduced presentation time is clearly greater for those with nystagmus. That is, there is a bigger reduction in their acuity as their time to see is reduced. It's not a huge effect, but it is measurable and significant statistically. So in essence, those with infantile nystagmus do in fact need some more time to see things well than those without the nystagmus eye movements. So finally, a recent theoretical model addressing the cause of nystagmus includes the assumption that the ability to follow a moving target with your eyes, which we call smooth pursuit, or tracking, is normal in those with nystagmus. That's the assumption made by the model. And yet pursuit has not been well investigated thus far in this condition. There are only a few studies that haven't really addressed this question directly. So the question is that really the case? Is pursuit operating normally in infantile nystagmus? Well, as you can see here, people with nystagmus can indeed follow a moving target as it moves from right to left, left to right, right to left, as this graph shows. But all during this pursuit, you can also see that the horizontal nystagmus oscillation is continuing. So hence the wiggly line is the oscillation of nystagmus. But overall, people are able to reasonably track the left-right movement of this target. Now, if we zero in on this eye movement, you can see that what is actually happening is that the eyes keep drifting away from the moving target, and the fast reset eye movements that are characteristic of this nystagmus oscillation are used to return the eyes to the target. So each time the slow phase takes the eyes away from the moving target, eventually the eyes catch up with the target by using this fast phase. So yes, the answer is, and by the way, you'll notice in this particular trace that the slow phase drift is actually moving in the opposite direction to the, or whether or not it moves in the same direction as the target, the fast phases accurately refoveate the target. So the answer is yes, those with nystagmus can pursue, but the eye movement is clearly very unusual. This is not the way people without nystagmus would pursue a target. It would indeed be a smooth pursuit. So our conclusion is that those with nystagmus can indeed pursue a moving target, both horizontally and vertically, by the way, but the ongoing oscillatory eye movements clearly interfere with the execution of what we would call smooth pursuit. So it still remains an open question whether the pursuit control system in the brain is operating normally, and that is an experiment that we hope to carry out sometime in the near future. So in summary, I'd just like to sort of summarize what I've been talking with you about with you today. The first is that, and this is kind of an important conclusion from our studies, is that the relationship between visual acuity and nystagmus eye movement intensity is only between individuals. So if a given individual on average has a high intensity nystagmus, they are likely to have a lower visual acuity. However, in a given individual, even though we can dramatically change the intensity, amplitude, frequency of their eye movements, this only, if any, has a minimal effect on their visual acuity. And that is in itself quite interesting, because it suggests that the overall visual acuity of a given individual has already been hardwired, and that changes of eye movement within that individual aren't going to really ultimately impact on their bottom line visual acuity. And finally, almost finally, the small improvement in visual acuity that we see at the null zone or after treatment may reflect actually a change in criterion or indeed comfort. It may just be that you are more comfortable looking in your null zone because it takes less energy, the eyes aren't moving as fast, and you avoid trying to make any kind of visual discrimination outside of your null zone. And if you are forced to do so, as we did in our study, then the likelihood is that you are going to give up a little more easily. That's at least one of the theories we're working on at the moment. And finally, pursuit gain, that is the actual matching of the speed of the pursuit, the overall pursuit of the target with its velocity, does appear to be relatively normal in people with nystagmus. But as we've seen, the eye movements themselves that are used by people with nystagmus to pursue the target in light of their ongoing oscillation are highly unusual. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say. I just thought there always are lots of other people who are responsible for getting this work accomplished. And I'm, as I say, privileged to work with a very talented, dedicated group of people, all of whom at one point or another in their research activities devote time and energy and enthusiasm towards trying to understand infantile nystagmus better. And last but not least, we have to thank the people who have been funding our research, and I'm sure my colleagues would join me in thanking all of these very generous financial funding supports that we get in order to both support the personnel to do the experiments, to pay participants for their expense and travel costs, and to basically get the equipment that we need to do the work I've been describing today. So I just wanted to end by thanking you very much for your attention, and I hope that the Open Day is, as always, a great success. And I look forward possibly to interacting with some of you this coming weekend. Thank you again. So long.